Audio check. Right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to week, whatever it is, 8 of the inquiry. So I can't remember the days, I'm now losing track of the weeks. We've got a number of housekeeping matters just to run through in opening, and then obviously we'll move on to Mr. Melling. A couple of documentary things, just so that you know what we've got. You'll remember that we've had discussions on highways conditions, and the panel had asked National Highways, as they are now, for some further material. That has sort of morphed across to Somerset County Council as the Highway Authority. We have no problem with that, but we've had a response from them with a number of documents, which I suspect a number of the parties may have seen. I don't think they're up on the website yet, but they will be. But we've had a response from Somerset County. Following on from that, what we have done is gone back to the County Council and basically said, well, if they'd like to attend the conditions session on Friday, they're very welcome to do so, but we're not particularly asking them to do that. The material they've sent in, I'm not saying whether we agree with it or not, but it seems to be, I think, as comprehensive as it's going to be. So they may join us on Friday, they may not, but we'll make sure that those documents, which I think, I'm not sure quite when they came in, we only saw them on the journey down yesterday. So anyway, those documents are in. Other documents, we have also seen comments on the BEIS document from the appellant, from council, from BAAN, from PCAA, and from XR Elders. Those documents all came in on time, end of last week, so we've got those.
Just on those, I've noticed on the inquiry website that a number of them seem to have appeared twice with different numbers, which is not, in a sense, problematic. I mean, that's happened with a number of documents, but we probably ought to decide which ones are going to be the ones that we're all going to use.
Right, thanks for that. So we've got the BEIS documents, and we've got the County Council Highways docs to sort out on the website. Right, thanks very much for that. We've also seen, and again, I suspect others may have done, but the West of England Joint Committee on the 21st of September, we sort of knew this was coming, approved a motion opposing the expansion proposals at Bristol Airport. We've got that I hope is on the website, and that was flagged up as a probability, but that's now happened. The only other documentation that I'd mention, and I'm just drawing this to the parties' attention, if it is something that the parties want to comment on. We have seen a press report that the World Health Organization has produced something, and I'll explain why I say something, talking about a reduction in the recommended limits for air pollution. All that we know is the fact that we read the papers, and we've seen that reported in the papers. We obviously don't go hunting for evidence. I have no idea, we have no idea what's in that document and whether it's of any relevance or not. But simply so that everybody is aware that it's out there. And what I'm going to suggest on that is, and I can't give you a hyperlink because I haven't got it, but it's World Health Organization. It was reported in the press 2 days ago, 3 days ago. If anybody thinks that, having looked at whatever it is, that it is of relevance and we ought to consider it, I'll ask again on Thursday morning. So you've got a couple of days to have a look at whatever it is, and then I'll ask on Thursday morning, and if anyone feels it is an important document, we can deal with it then. So that is that. Skipping for the moment this week, going on to next week, the timings of closing submissions. Working backwards, next week, on Friday, it's the appellant, and obviously the appellant, who has got, is it 5 closing submissions to take into account, needs a gap to consider the closings of the other parties. So Friday it's the appellant. Thursday morning, as it stands, and I'll explain what I mean by that, it's Ms. de Haan for BAAN. Now, just want to be clear where we are on this, because I know that she said she couldn't do Wednesday. Can she do Tuesday? And
No, sir. I understand she's been contacted the program manager. Unfortunately, Thursday is actually the only day that she can do. She can't do the Tuesday or the Wednesday. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. It's understood, and she did, well, you did warn us about that. So Thursday morning will be BAAN. That leaves us obviously with the other parties, the council and other parties' closings on Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, I've seen bits and pieces of correspondence bouncing around on this, but it doesn't seem to have progressed anywhere.
So I contacted Ms. de Haan to see whether there was any movement possible in her dates, and what you've just heard is where we got to in our email correspondence. So I have been working to a timetable that means that we would be giving our closing on Wednesday, as we discussed, I think, not last week, but the week before. So that's the way we're assuming we're going. So I'm making way, as it were, from the CMC agreed programme for Ms. de Haan because of her timetabling difficulties.
Okay, so Wednesday we have the council. You think? Shall we put the rest in Tuesday? They're short, isn't it? Sure. Yeah. I mean, sorry, just Tuesday for the rest? Yeah. So working back, let me just run through it backwards again. Friday, it's the appellant. Thursday morning, BAAN. Wednesday morning, on that basis, it would be the council. And Tuesday, it would be the closings for all the other parties. And most of you have given indications of the likely length of your closing, and they're quite brief. So I think we'll deal with all the other closings first, then the council on the next day, BAAN on Thursday morning, and then the appellant. The only person I believe, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we have a timing for the closing from Ms. Sutherland, who I can see is with us on Teams. If you'd be good enough to let the programme officer have your timing for the closing. Oh, and I'm getting a wave from the back of the room. Is that a yes? Yeah. Hello.
I was just going to say, I've already done that one, sir.
Okay. No, that's fine. Okay, so everybody else on the Tuesday, then the council, then BAAN, and then obviously there'll be gaps. It's a very light week in closing, and we can deal with it in that order. Okay, moving on to this week. We've obviously got the final, in inverted commas, set of conditions, which we're going to be discussing on Friday of this week. Can I just get an update on the Section 106, Section 106's plural? In particular, when do we get to see them?
Yes, my understanding is that there have been a number of meetings over the last few days, and indeed I think there are further meetings planned. Maybe there is one today, I can't quite remember, but there certainly are others. I think the idea was that something would be sent to you on Wednesday. I'll stand corrected if I've got that wrong. At the moment, because there are a few things where it may not be possible for us to resolve differences, and because obviously unlike conditions where we can just simply say, look, inspectors, it's for you to decide, that may mean, it may not, but it may mean that there is a Section 106 agreement, and then carved out of it, where there is not agreement, there is a unilateral undertaking with some obligations. Obviously, the parties, both parties, are trying to see if they can come to a middle way that doesn't necessitate that, but but that is possible.
Okay.
So that's not my understanding where we've got to at all, I'm afraid.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My understanding is that there is a UU being drawn up on various clauses where the parties have reached an impasse, rather than the approach that we suggested of putting alternate clauses in planning obligation and allowing you to strike out whichever one using the blue pencil test. We're waiting for a draft of the UU. We haven't seen one yet. We were told we would have one early this morning, and it's not arrived. So that's where we understand we are.
Well, obviously there are people behind the scenes working on this, and maybe the information hasn't quite reached the front desks at the moment in some way. No problem with that. I think what I would say is that whichever way we're going, we need to have something by close of play on Wednesday. Really don't want whatever it is coming in on Thursday. And if that means that what we see on Wednesday isn't the final, in inverted commas, version, well, so be it. But we do need to look through it, and I don't want to rush through it on Thursday.
I quite agree. I mean, if we're going to see a UU for the first time this week, and we want it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go back, obviously, to Mr. Humphreys, because I appreciate that there are people on your side working behind the scenes, and you're not probably fully in the picture. Absolutely fine. But Wednesday for that, please. Now, turning on finally from us to this week, the draft programme is on the website, but essentially we have Mr. Melling this morning giving evidence in chief for the first time. I've called you Mr. Melling 1 and Mr. Melling 2, but that's purely my note. So we've got Mr. Melling 1 this morning, and then cross-examination by the Council. I'll skip over Balper for the moment. By the Council, by BAAN, by PCAA, by Ms. Sutherland, and by XR Elders. I've got all your timings on that. Some of them are quite lengthy. Experience of this inquiry actually shows that everybody has been working to time at best, and actually most of the time cutting down on the time estimates. So we are a bit concerned with the timing this week, but not panicking. Yes.
Sorry, sir. I think Mr. Hon is actually cross-examining Mr. Melling 2 rather than Mr. Melling 1. I think there's been some...
I probably shouldn't have called you that.
I think there's been some correspondence with the programme officer about that.
Actually, my fault. I did know that, so you're not cross-examining today or whenever it may be, but I have got a note actually that it's on the second appearance, as it were. Sounds even worse. Okay, so we are still a bit tight. Yes, Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you very much. I've just noticed on the circulated proposal, and I thought that communications had gone in to indicate our principal cross-examination around this area was intended to essentially deal with legal submissions on the Habitats Directive.
Yep.
And my understanding is that you as inspectors have invited that to be done in writing or in the submissions to the inquiry rather than by way of cross-examination. And so I thought it had been communicated, but I don't think we will have any cross-examination at all, whereas it's listed for, I think, quite some time. So my apologies if there's been an error in that communication, but hopefully it'll be by way of causing relief on your part and on the timetable's point of view.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I do recall your comments about the need for legal submissions on that matter, which, yeah, we'll assume comes in closing.
Thank you.
Ms. Sutherland, you've also got your hand up.
Sir, it was just to clarify that my intention was to cross-examine Mr. Melling in relation to both aspects, hence my timing suggested of 2 hours. So I'm not sure whether that means the programme officer would rather put me at the end of Mr. Melling 2, as it were, or whether to leave me where I am at the moment. I really don't mind, but I did intend to cross-examine on both aspects.
Well, you'll be doing it twice then, as I put down, not just on my note, an hour each, but exactly as, for example, the Council is doing, the council and yourself and others will be cross-examining Mr. Melling twice on different aspects of his case. So today we're on Greenbelt, and then we're on the planning balance, which will come back on, for cross-examination, we'll come back on Thursday, won't we? Okay, well, with
Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks. With those comments, I feel a bit easier. Miss Beth.
Thank you. Yeah, I also wanted to cross-examine on the planning balance issues, as well as Green Belt.
Yeah, I've got you down via the programme officer. It may not be on the website, but I've got you down as about half an hour on planning balance issues for cross-examination. Got that.
Thank you.
The only, Ms Sutherland, you've still got your hand up. I think it's probably a legacy hand. The only other matter that I need to raise in terms of this week's programme, and have we got anybody here from Balper? I don't think we have. No. As people will remember, for very good reasons, Mr. Melling was actually moved into today from last week. What has then happened is that Balper have indicated that they want to cross-examine for about half an hour on Greenbelt matters. The problem is, and I'm not criticising anybody here, but the problem is that Balper are not available today and most of tomorrow. There's been correspondence with Mr. Renshaw about this, but I'm not criticising him for a moment because he's always said that he wouldn't be available today and tomorrow, and obviously the movement of this particular witness into today has caused the problem. What Mr. Renshaw has said is that he's not going to be able to, I presume, listen to the evidence or indeed listen to the other cross-examination of Mr. Melling, but he would be available at 4 o'clock. Can't remember if that was on Teams or physically, but it doesn't matter. But he would be available at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Now, the issue there, obviously, Mr. Humphreys, this is very much one for you, is that depending on how we're going, and I haven't added up the new timings, we're probably going to deal in the main, if not completely, with Mr. Melling in chief and cross-examination today. But Mr. Renshaw can't be with us until 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, by which time, and indeed it is a matter for Mr. Taylor as well, we're going to be well into the planning case for the council. Now, I don't criticise Mr. Renshaw at all, it's circumstances. The only way that I can think of doing it, and be very happy to hear alternatives, is that we progress today, we deal with Mr. Welling. I would suggest, and this is one for you, Mr. Humphreys, that after the cross-examination today, you could re-examine on all those matters. Then at some convenient point, call it 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, which will be somewhere in the council's evidence, we hear some further cross-examination of Mr. Melling, call him back at 4 o'clock for what I understand will be about a half an hour, and then if there's any re-examination on that, obviously you can do that then. Does that work for both of you?
It's fine, sir.
So if this allows us to have Melling free, then definitely yes.
I really do wish I hadn't said that, but yeah, okay, let's do it that way. And what we'll ask the programme officer to do is to confirm with Mr. Renshaw that he can come along at 4 o'clock or thereabouts, depending on how it slots in tomorrow for his questions of Mr. Melling. Okay, I think that was it from us. Anybody else got any procedural queries? No, and there aren't any hands up. Okay, then Mr. Humphreys, without further ado, let's turn over to you for your next witness.
Mr. Melling, I'm just going to introduce you now by reference to section 1.1 of your full proof of evidence. Is your name Alexander Melling?
It is.
and you're an associate director at Wood, and you have approximately 13 years planning experience. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you tell us in section 1.1 about your qualifications and your experience. You started in local government, and then you moved to Wood or its predecessor companies in 2008, and you became an associate director. You tell us that you have provided planning support to Bristol Airport for over 10 years, and that included preparation and submission of the planning applications for the additional car parking, the discharge of conditions, advice on operations. Wood was also appointed in February 2018 to manage the preparation of the current application under appeal, and you were the project manager for that and were involved in a lot of the negotiations with officers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And indeed, between mid-2019 and mid-2020, you were in fact seconded in as Val's planning manager for a period.
Yes, on a temporary basis. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Melling, we're dealing today just with your Greenbelt evidence, and as far as the policy context for Greenbelt is concerned, I think that you and Mr. Gertler are completely agreed on that. You both refer to the NPPF and the test of looking at purposes of the land and openness. Is that correct? There's no dispute between you, as I understand it.
No, there's no dispute. I think we're in agreement that broadly the relevant policy here is Section 13 of the NPPF, which, as you said, establishes the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt and the requirement to demonstrate very special circumstances. And then in terms of local policy, I think we're also in agreement that the relevant policies are Core Strategy Policy CS6, which establishes the Greenbelt boundary or confirms the Greenbelt boundary. Policy DM12 of the Sites and Policies Plan Part 1, which confirms or reiterates the policy approach taken in the NPPF in terms of the requirement to demonstrate very special circumstances for inappropriate development. And then finally, policy DM50, which requires that outside of the inset, the developer, in this case the airport, must demonstrate very special circumstances.
And can we just touch on those 2 local plan policies for a moment to see what the expectation was in terms of the Greenbelt inset and what it was expected to accommodate. So look please at the core strategy, that's CD 5.6, and turn to PDF page 45, that's policy CS6.
Yes, I have that.
And we're familiar with the policy there. We've obviously looked at that before, but I just want to look at some of the supporting text in relation to Bristol Airport at paragraph 3.96. That's on the next page, PDF page 46. And it tells us there that the replacement local plan created an inset in the Greenbelt to accommodate the medium-term expansion requirements of the airport. And so we understand what medium-term is, what is the plan period for the core strategy?
Yes, so the plan period for the core strategy is to 2026. And just to sort of expand on that, really, the replacement local plan and indeed the core strategy were developed in the context of development of the airport to accommodate 10 million passengers per annum.
And You mentioned also DN50, and we need to go to the development management policies there, so CD 5.4. And in that document, turn to page 5.4, turn to page 119. And again, we have there policy DN50 relating to Bristol Airport. And again, just turn to the bottom of that page, top of the next page. And again, this section, the policy wording largely repeats the criteria for airport-related development within the Lullsgate inset from the North Somerset Replacement Local Plan, which are sufficient to deal with minor development that requires further grant of planning permission, and outside the inset, the Greenbelt policy applies, and it would be for the developer to demonstrate very special circumstances that outweigh harm to Greenbelt or any other harm. So again, just so the inspectors have some understanding, what again was the intention and the purpose of the inset?
Well, I think, as I just mentioned, really, it's that the two plans were developed in the context of growth of the airport to 10 million passengers per annum, and in that context, the inset was not intended to deal with expansion of the airport beyond 10 million passengers per annum. And indeed, you can see that the paragraph you've just took me to there refers to minor development in the inset, whereas outside of the inset, it's for the developer to demonstrate very special circumstances, as our case is that we have done just that.
And then moving on, still sort of a preliminary point, but there's a point that's been raised by Ms. Beth that the entire application is premature. Again, in relation to that, and you know, we can look if we want at the prematurity provisions in the MPPF. Does it undermine the plan making process, or is the emerging plan at an advanced stage? To what extent do you say that this application is premature?
I disagree with that assertion. I think the MPPF is quite clear that prematurity should not normally be used as a reason to refuse planning permission. And I think it's, Ms. Beth, I think in proof of evidence refers to the supporting text of the core strategy, which sets out the Council's expectation at that time that development requiring consent beyond 10 million passengers per annum should be the subject of an area action plan or a similar development plan document, DPD. That's supporting text, that's not in the policy, it's not a policy requirement. And indeed, I think that was the position taken by officers in the officer report.
And I think, I don't know whether you have CD 5.6 still open, but if we were to look at, to pick up Ms. Beth's point, if we were to look at PDF page 97, we would get to policy CS 23, and below that, paragraph 3.293 is the paragraph that refers to additional development requiring consent beyond 2011, i.e. the planning permission which has been granted is expected to form the subject of an action area plan or other development plan documents such as a subject-based plan for aviation, defining detailed criteria at core strategy. This is not supported by Bristol Airport, but it remains the council's preference. And as you say, I mean, this was specifically raised by officers. We can look at it if we need to. But what was officers' view about this?
Well, as I said, yes. So this was raised during the determination of the planning application by some parties with reference to this part of the core strategy, and the officers' view was that it is not a policy requirement, and therefore the application is not premature, and that's clearly stated in the officers' report.
Thank you. And then let's move on now to the issue of inappropriate development, and there's obviously agreement between the parties that the year-round use of the seasonal car park, Cogley 1, is inappropriate development, and the extension of the Silver Zone car park to Cogley 2 is inappropriate development. But we have these two areas that Mr. Goethe has raised where you're in disagreement, and one is airside infrastructure enhancements, those fillets at the side of the taxiway and so on, and secondly the A38 works. Again, we know the officer's view on that, so let's just touch hopefully briefly on those two. So airside infrastructure, first of all, it's agreed these are engineering operations. We've looked at them before. What do you say for these extension fillets to the taxiway and so on? What do you say about those in relation to the purposes of the Greenbelt, first of all?
Well, just to take a step back there, so yeah, just to confirm that both Mr. Gettler and I do agree that the airside infrastructure improvements, that's the taxiway widening, fillets, and the taxiway link to the east, they are types of development that fall within the categories listed in the NPPF as not being inappropriate development, provided that they preserve openness and do not conflict with the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt. But as Mr. Humphries, you've just said, Mr. Gertler's view is that there would be harm to the Greenbelt in spatial and visual terms, which I don't accept. I wonder if it's just helpful just to go to the plan. I think it's at CD 1.8, just so the inspectors are clear. I'm sure they are, but in terms of what we're actually, the part of the development we're actually talking about here.
So CD 1.8.
Yes, which is the site plan, the proposed site plan. You can see the airside infrastructure improvements we're talking about. So it's the widening of the taxiway there, taxiway Golf, and then the eastern taxiway link.
So in relation to firstly the purposes of the Greenbelt.
Yeah, so if we, I think it might be helpful if I just take each of the 5 purposes in turn that are set out in the NPPF. So the first, would it check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas? In my opinion, the development won't result in any change to the existing built-up area, and the scale and the nature of works are really not in any way, I wouldn't consider they constitute urban sprawl. Turning to the second purpose, so to prevent neighbouring towns from merging into one another, clearly these aren't the types of works that would result in towns merging into one another. Turning to purpose C, to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. Well, the works will take place in an airfield, so I would argue that they won't result in any encroachment on the countryside. The airfield effectively already forms part of the countryside. Ditto purpose, the fourth purpose, so to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. The assessment contained in the environmental statement has shown that the development won't have any impact on the setting or character of any historic towns in that development, including the airside infrastructure improvements. And then the final purpose, to assist in urban regeneration. So yes, they're part of a proposal which we consider will deliver regeneration in terms of the benefits, in terms of job creation, but in itself that land isn't suitable for regeneration, or by developing that land, won't prevent regeneration elsewhere.
And then in relation to openness, and bearing in mind there are these two aspects of openness, both sort of physical and visual openness, perhaps you can just talk us through your views on that.
Yes, so I think we have to bear in mind here that the works are a surface level, and as I mentioned before, they're in an area already comprising of the runway and apron, so in my view they clearly won't affect or will have a negligible impact on openness. And we can see that if we need to, we could look at some of the viewpoints. I don't think I probably have to take you there, but I think from most of the viewpoints, if not all of them, in the environmental statement, in the LVIA contained in the environmental statement, you can't see those works.
And finally, the officers' views on this particular point and in relation to openness.
Yes, officers agreed that this element of the development would not result in any harm to the openness of the green belt.
And then ditto, same exercise for the A38 works, so the widening works around the approach to the airport. Again, if you could just explain that again. This is agreed to be local transport infrastructure, just purposes, and then openness again briefly.
Yeah, so apologies, but I'll just take you through the 5 purposes again, just so we're all very clear. But I mean, this is all set out in my proof of evidence. But so if we take those in turn, so the first purpose, to check unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. Again, my view is that the development will not result in any change to the existing built-up area. And again, like the airside infrastructure works, the scale and nature of the works would not in any way constitute urban sprawl. Second purpose, to prevent towns merging into one another. Again, I don't see that the works would have any impact on that purpose. The third purpose, to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. The works will largely be within the existing highway, and any additional land take will be very, very small, so I don't think there'll be an impact on that purpose. Again, as I've already said, in terms of the wider development, there wouldn't be an impact on the setting or special character of historic towns. And then finally, in terms of the fifth purpose, urban regeneration, again, the works are part of a wider scheme that will facilitate regeneration, but they can't be delivered elsewhere, and they won't detract from promoting regeneration in any other location. So I don't think there'd be any impact on that purpose.
And openness again, and here perhaps usefully we do have a montage which shows not all but some of these works. So perhaps have a look at that and then just get you to comment on it. So CD 3.4.8. This was, I think, a technical note that was produced responding to various comments by the council and others, and it includes a montage in it. So within that document 3.4.8, turn to PDF page 15. And you can see there a sort of before and after of
Yes.
some of the works, and again, just comments on openness, really.
Yeah, I think, so yeah, just by way of context for this photo montage or visualization, this was requested by officers during the determination of the application, just so they could understand better the landscape and visual impacts of the A38 works, and you can see here that in terms of encroachment into the countryside, the landtake is very, very limited, and the visual impacts will be very, very minor, and that's the landscape and visual impact assessment contained in the environmental statement came to that exact conclusion, that the impacts on visual receptors would be minor.
Yes, and obviously no planting or anything shown there. Again, the conclusions of the officers on this point.
Yeah, so officers came to the same conclusion. I think it's at page 106 of the officers' report. I think they came to the conclusion that yes, the works are largely on developed land, and so any encroachment into the countryside would be extremely limited, and so the development wouldn't conflict with the purposes of including land in the green belt, nor would the works affect openness.
And what about the council and indeed other local authorities' views when they've been promoting other highway improvements that run through the Bristol Greenbelt? And do they typically regard those improvements as being inappropriate development?
So yes, I make this point in my rebuttal that the approach taken by officers in terms of the A38 works is very much consistent with that taken by the council and indeed Bristol City Council and inspectors on the South Bristol link, which involved the realignment of around 5 kilometres of highway, including land through the Greenbelt. So a much more extensive development, but even in that case, the conclusion of all those parties was that the development was not inappropriate development in the Greenbelt.
And then finally, if the inspectors did conclude that this is inappropriate development, in your rebuttal, you have a paragraph that sets out very special circumstances.
Yes, so it's paragraph 4.2.10, and I set out 3 very special circumstances. So yes, if the inspectors were to conclude that the development was inappropriate, those very special circumstances would include need. So the changes to the airside infrastructure, they're required to accommodate an additional 2 million passengers per annum. Specifically, the taxiway link is needed to improve access to the runway from the eastern apron, whilst the widening and fillets are needed to provide a parallel taxiway system, and that basically provides improved access and efficiency of movement for aircraft, and that in turn will minimise delays. And then in terms of the A38 works, the transport assessment and the subsequent addendum to that assessment have demonstrated that the works are required to mitigate the traffic impacts of an additional 2 million passengers. The second very special circumstance, as I've already alluded to, is the fact that both components of the scheme would have only a negligible impact on the openness of the green belt. And then finally, the third very special circumstance is that both elements are very much an integral part of the wider development, and they're forming part of the strategy that makes best use of the airport, and in turn will deliver the significant benefits that I refer to in section 3.5 of my proof of evidence, and as Mr. Brass discussed in his evidence.
And then let's close the door on those two aspects of what is said to be inappropriate development. Just turn to the car park south of the airport, and I want to just identify first your Appendix A in your proof of evidence sets out a greenbelt assessment of the land, a technical note where you're one of the authors, along with Mr. Ferber, who we heard from before the break. Just to clarify, did the council ask for an assessment of this sort in the lead up to the determination of the application?
No, not during the determination of the application.
And this assessment looks at, obviously, purposes of land, and it looks at openness, and in terms of openness it looks at physical or spatial openness and visual openness. So let's just start with the seasonal car park, Cog Loop 1, and in the appendix this is identified as parcel S1. So can you just sort of explain to the inspectors briefly, I mean they will have read these documents, but just briefly pull out the important points about parcel S1 in relation to its purposes.
Yes, so I mean, I'll just take the two elements of openness, so physical openness and then visual openness.
Or purposes first?
Oh, sorry, purposes first. Yeah. So we conclude that parcel S1, so that's the existing seasonal car park extension, makes only a limited contribution to one greenbelt purpose, and that's to prevent encroachment. And that really reflects the fact that it is an existing car park, and in that wider parcel there are also other ancillary uses.
And in that Appendix A, I think at page 36, I'm going now from the paper copy rather than the PDF copy, you've set out there a landscape plan. It should be pages numbered at the top left.
Yep.
36. Can you just explain to the inspectors what that is?
Yeah, so that's the landscape plan that accompanied the planning application. Sorry, I was speaking to the microphone. That's the landscape plan that accompanied the planning application for the Silver Zone extension back in 2016. And as the inspectors will know and will have probably seen from their site visit, there's a bund as part of that scheme around the southern and western sides. And what purpose that bund provides is it effectively screens views of the car park. And obviously that fund is continuing to mature over time.
I think some of the photos we have in the ES date from 2018.
2018,
you can
yes.
see the legend, but obviously the inspectors, I imagine, will have seen it on site, and if not, can go and have another look if they need to. So you touched on purposes, then openness, physical and visual openness in relation to this particular parcel.
Yes, so in terms of the baseline, if you will, so as I've said before, it's obviously an existing car park, so in our view has very low physical openness. And because of the mitigation that's already in place, we conclude, and also the type of developments, the character of the development, it's obviously low-rise character development, it's predominantly car parking, and it benefits from that screening, so we conclude that it has only low to moderate visual openness. And that openness, as I've just said, will be impacted by the screening over time, that visual openness.
And again, you've pointed to the principal viewpoints from Winters Lane. From other places around the area around that, are there other visual viewpoints that the inspectors should?
No, there's maybe some fleeting glimpses from the A38 perhaps, but no, the principal view is from Winters Lane, and it's specifically at the right hand, the bend there in Winters Lane where you can get, again, it's only a glimpsed view of the car park.
And if we then, in that appendix, turn to pages 26 and 27, we just get your assessment. On page 27, we have the figure which identifies the two areas of land. We're still dealing with the purple circled one,
Yes.
the existing one, and then table 4.5. If you look on the previous page of paragraph 4.5.1, you can see reference to table 4.5 being assessment of the likely effects of the phase 1 development, cog loop 1, with purple boundary. I think somehow the title to table 4.5 has got stuck under the
Yes, I think the figure's gone over the table title.
But is that below the figure 4.1, the photo? Is that table 4.5?
Yeah, immediately below figure 4.1.
Yeah. And that sets out the evaluation, and again, just really the conclusions, your conclusions from that, please.
Yeah, so in terms of impacts on openness, we conclude that the development of the Silver Zone car park extension, and bear in mind this is an existing car park, so this would be the year-round use of that car park, as opposed to the use just in the peak summer months, would have only a negligible impact on the green belt, and that takes into account the existing use of the site. We've taken into account that the impacts of any permanent lighting and associated CCTV columns. We've also taken into account the existing screening there, and that boundary planting will mature over time. And indeed, I think this is very much consistent with the conclusions of the landscape and visual impact assessment, and the subsequent analysis by Mr. Further in supporting the development of this evidence, that impacts on visual receptors will be primarily along Winters Lane, and those impacts will just be very glimpsed and fleeting views. Any impacts on other receptors, including the AONB, would be negligible.
And then if we do the same exercise for cog loop 2, or phase 2 as it's sometimes called, which is the silver zone extension purposes, that's also sometimes called parcel S2. Purposes, first of all?
Yes, so I think Mr. Gertler and I, we do agree that this parcel does make a contribution to the green belt in terms of preventing encroachment into the open countryside, and that reflects the character of that parcel.
And openness, again, physical openness, visual openness.
Again, reflecting the character of that particular parcel. There's limited development there, it's frequent development, so we conclude that the physical openness is high.
And visual openness?
Sorry, I'm just onto the table. So we conclude that in terms of visual openness, it is low to moderate. And that again reflects the fact that that whilst there are some long and middle distance views, they're really predominantly concentrated along Winters Lane, with some glimpse views from the A38 only.
And this, if we turn to that appendix, page 11, in the appendix, we can see parcel S2, and we can see there the assessment on physical openness and visual openness.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much, in terms of visual openness, it's very much seen as part of the wider context of the airport.
And again, are there many viewpoints of that particular site?
No. Winters Lane is the principal viewpoint. Again, views are only glimpsed, and from other receptors, including the AONB, it's not, you wouldn't be able to make out that particular parcel.
And then that appendix again, if we go to pages 28, 29 in the paper copy again, table 4.6, that's where you pull together the assessment, and again, no need to read it all out, but what basically are the key messages that the inspectors should take away from this?
Yes, so we conclude that the development of that site for car parking would have only limited harm to the openness of the green belt, taking into account the mitigation both provided by the existing landscape bund and the proposed new bund to the south of that site. Again, that also reflects the nature of the development, being low-lying cars parked there, and the planting will minimise the harm associated with those cars. And again, it reflects very much the findings of the landscape and visual impact assessment, which concluded that there would be no significant effects from that element of the development, or indeed any part of the development, on any receptors, including the AONB. I know there have been some concerns expressed by some parties in terms of impacts at night, but my understanding is that there'll be a specific lighting design adopted with that element of the scheme, which will minimise outward spill of lights, and the lights will only be used when there's movement in the car park itself.
Thank you for that. And then let's move from harm to the green belt to the separate topic of very special circumstances, and we'll just start with a few general points. Mr. Gertler makes the point that the current applications are readily distinguishable from the previous decisions to develop in the Greenbelt. Just briefly get you to touch on those points. And we know the previous decisions were set out in the officer's report. You can see them on page 107 of CD 4.11. What does that tell you about the officer's view about the relevance of the previous decisions?
Well, I think the officer's report refers to those decisions. It refers to, in particular, the need for low-cost parking. So clearly, it's these elements. They felt that those previous decisions are relevant to the decision on this application.
And there are obviously a couple of decisions, I suppose. There was the 2016 Silver Zone Extension Phase 1 permission. There was also the 2018 temporary variation of Condition 3 permission. I mean, just very broadly, has the policy context materially changed, as Mr. Gertler suggests?
I would argue not. If we just take very, very briefly, because I know we'll pick up on some of this during the planning balance topic during Melling 2, I'm sure.
Is it Melling the sequel?
Yeah, Melling the sequel, yes. So in terms of aviation policy, making best use is well-established government policy dating back even as far as the air transport white paper, and certainly into the APF and more recently the making best use policy document itself. And the APF was in place at the time of the 2016 planning application for the Silver Zone extension, and ditto for the temporary variation of Condition 3 to allow the year-round use of the seasonal car park. And then in terms of planning policy, as I think Mr. Gertler acknowledges in his proof of evidence, Greenbelt policy itself has remained largely unchanged in terms of both the MPPF and the development plan policy, and indeed the MPPF and the core strategy and the sites and policy plan part 1 were adopted at the time of the 2016 decision and then subsequently the 2018 decision.
And as to the formal type of development, is that materially different?
I would argue not. If we take, for example, the 2016 development that considered car parking, additional car parking in the Greenbelt, which is very similar to what we're proposing here in terms of the further extension to the Silver Zone. And even if you look further back at the 2011 decision in terms for the expansion of the airport to 10 million passengers per annum, that included car parking as part of the wider development of the airport, again similar to the nature and scope of the application that is being considered here.
So in your view, what assistance do we get from the previous decisions in understanding that the types of things that in this area are regarded as being very special circumstances?
But in all of those decisions, similar very special circumstances were advanced by the airport and accepted by officers at that time, and indeed tested in the courts. So what that says to me is that those same very special circumstances hold true now and should be given weight.
Thank you. Now let's move on to the specifics of the very special circumstance, and very special circumstance 1, which is need for additional car parking in the Greenbelt. And in your proof at page 89, paragraph 5.4.3, you make the point that the need for additional car parking in the Greenbelt is driven by a number of factors, and you list there 5 factors. And so I'm going to take you through a number of these points. So first, just demand, car parking demand, first of all. What's driving car parking demand? Where do you?
In terms of the evidence that I've taken into account. So as I think I refer to all of this evidence in my proof and then subsequently in my rebuttal evidence. So that would be the parking demand study, CD 2.11, the subsequent update to that study, CD 2.23, I think. The parking strategy, CD 2.12, I think, and then finally the evidence of Mr. Witchell's, which has reviewed and validated the findings of the parking demand study and its subsequent update.
And what is the core strategy position on developments providing car parking?
So I think if I take you to policy CS11, and that's in the core strategy, I think is CD 5.6, page 61. I'll just go there myself as well. And you can see from the sort of top line of that policy, it sets out that adequate parking must be provided and managed to meet the needs of anticipated users in usable spaces. And my view is very much that this development responds to that requirement by making appropriate parking provision to meet demand as passengers grow to 2 million passengers per annum. But importantly, that it's as part of a balanced approach which also supports the transport hierarchy by promoting sustainable forms of transport.
And then let's just look at demand. So perhaps you could have open the parking demand study update, CD 2.23. And CD 2.23, and let's start by going to the very end and then kind of working back. So if we go to page 20, which is towards the end, figure, it's not very end, but figure 15.
Yes.
And the 2030 figures, we get the peak month, August, the peak demand there at 30,000 200 spaces, and that's obviously well beyond the capacity that's being proposed, even with the extensions. So how do we work, how do we get to the number of spaces that you included to show very special circumstances?
Yes, I think Mr. Witchell's explained this quite clearly during his evidence. So the figure we have here is for the peak month of August, which is the month that we're most interested in terms of providing capacity to accommodate growth. And that figure of 30,200, that includes capacity both on the airport site and also off-site. So just to if I explain that perhaps a bit better, if you just scroll up slightly to figure 14, you can see at 2030 that's the requirement there. I mean, there's some rounding changes here, but the requirement for spaces to be provided on site. So that's the difference.
Yeah, so what, as you said, there's slight rounding, but a peak capacity proposed of 22,000, says there 300, but we also have 200,
yeah,
with 4,200 additional spaces, and the balance up to 30,200 is assumed to go into the unofficial car parking spaces, and then so that's the numbers of spaces. Can I just get you to touch on types of spaces? But can we look at the original parking demand study?
Yeah,
please?
just perhaps just before we do, just wanting to make the point that I do note that you know, as Mr. Witchells did explain during his evidence, that he has reviewed the parking demand study update and the parking demand study, the original parking demand study, and confirmed that the methodology adopted there is robust. And in fact, it does represent what the airport is proposing to provide on site, that 22,200, you know, given wider demand, it very much represents a tough capacity limit. And importantly, that limit has taken into account the airport's proposed stretching public transport mode share target. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to make that point.
No, you were very right to interrupt me. Just the original parking demand study, which we have as CD 2.11. I just want to get you in there to go to PDF page 27, which is the section on likely future capacity requirements. And this section deals with the type of demand, or the demand for the type of car parking that is required. And can you just sort of, again, very briefly, without going through it in detail, explain to the inspectors the board conclusion from that report? I think you do actually deal with it in your proof of evidence, so you may want to deal with it there.
Yeah, I deal with it in my my proof of evidence, and also in the planning statement where I provide a summary of this. But I think
so. In the proof of evidence, I think it's your page 97.
97, that's correct.
Paragraph 5.4.35.
Yes, that's right. And
so a number of points there.
I think what I take from the parking demand study, and indeed the parking demand study update, that, you know, it's important to understand not just the the overall quantum of parking capacity that is required, but also the nature of that demand. And what the evidence tells us is that there has been an increased demand for low-cost parking at the airport site, and that's because of a number of factors, which I list there in para 5.4.35 of my evidence, and I won't repeat those verbatim, but they include, there's a historic preference for low-cost parking that is driven, and future demand is driven by a number of factors, including an increasing propensity for leisure passengers to use low-cost parking because of the length of the stay and their willingness to pay, and also taking into account the different catchments where passengers are coming from as well. And then finally, there's been a growth in based aircraft at the airport, and what we mean by based aircraft are those aircraft that are effectively parked at the airport overnight and they leave in the first wave. So for those passengers using those aircraft, a lot of those passengers drive to the airport. And I think whilst the parking demand study, it has been updated, those fundamental drivers haven't changed.
And if we then look at turn to the airport's approach to meeting that demand, we can see that approach set out in the parking strategy document, different document, so CD 2.12, and perhaps you can just very briefly summarize what the strategy has been in terms of meeting demand.
Yes, so just very, very briefly, the parking strategy adopts a sequential approach to identifying the preferred solution to meeting the demand for car parking.
So if we turn to that document CD 2.12 and we turn to PDF page 27.
Yes, so
5.2.1 introduces that, as you just called it, the sequential approach.
Yes, so the sequential approach from what we have done is looked at, first of all, sites, potential development opportunity sites within the Greenbelt inset, so the north of the airfield, before then looking at strategic park and ride locations, then sites within the airport but outside of the inset, and then sites in Greenbelt locations contiguous to the airport site. And the broad approach is to ensure that all options have been explored in each of those categories before moving on to the next area of search in that sequential sequence, to ensure that development in the inset is maximised.
And we'll perhaps return to it later, but just as we're at that section, we can see on page 27 the next subheading down is sites within the Greenbelt inset, which is at the top of the sequential search, and on the next page there's a table which is appraisal of the Greenbelt inset options, and option A, excuse me, option A is what has in fact become MSCP3. The number of spaces there is the gross number of spaces. It doesn't take into account the loss of 650 spaces to give the net 1,500. And option B is an option that then adds a further a potential multi-storey or decked car park on the north side in addition, and that section explains why that was rejected, and we can see a number of reasons.
It does, yes.
So just coming back then, so take that as a little detour, but we'll come back to it. Just coming back then to demand, we've set out the demand, we've set out the approach to demand. I just want to, because obviously there's a primary conflict of evidence between Mr. Witchells on the one hand and Mr. Collis on the other about whether there is or should be that level of demand. I just want to ask you two sort of hypothetical what-ifs. And the first what-if, they're both what-ifs. Demand is less than the 4,200 that we say. And the first one, if demand is just assumed, the what-if, it's assumed to be less by 2,700 spaces, i.e. the size of the Cog Loop 1 and Cog Loop, or the Cog Loop 2, sorry, car park, but you still need 1,500 spaces. What then do you say about need and what needs to be provided?
Well, if on that basis you didn't deliver the extension to the further extension to the Silver Zone car park and brought forward MSCP 3, the parking price for MSCP 3 would still have to reflect and be consistent with, you know, the cost, and both in terms of capital cost and finance cost of delivering that facility. So if of those 1,500 spaces there was still demand for low cost parking, that demand wouldn't be met by the third multi-storey car park. So you then got to ask the question about, well, where would that demand transfer to? And you couldn't just assume that it would transfer to public transport, because that demand is from people who want to drive to the airport. So the risk would be then that it would transfer to unofficial, unauthorised car parks in the green belt, or it would transfer to drop-off, both of which are unacceptable outcomes.
And that premise, obviously that what if, that assumption that there's demand for 2,700 fewer spaces itself is based on Mr. Collins' proposition that that number of people instead would travel by public transport. But you know, to what extent is it safe to rely on that assumption or aspiration?
Well, I just couldn't accept it. It's the evidence. It's not supported by the evidence, and it's not supported by the testing that has been undertaken by Mr. Witchell. So that, I think that would lead me to the conclusion that approach would just be inherently risky, for want of a better term.
And if I just sort of slightly push now this assumption a stage further, what if one takes Mr. Collins' assumption that all the extra 4,200 spaces should not be provided, presumably because they go by public transport, and his suggestion that we don't need any additional car parking either in the Silver Zone or the MSCP. Again, what is your view on the appropriateness of that as as an approach, a planning approach in these circumstances?
I just say again, it doesn't, that approach would not, it's not supported by the evidence that's presented in the parking demand study in terms of the requirement to provide parking on site, but also the quantum of parking off site as well. So again, it would just be a risky approach, which has considerable potential to lead to more unofficial car parking in the green belt and drop off as well.
So if I just come back to, we were going through that list of the very special circumstances, need for additional car parking in your paragraph 543, and we talked about parking demand. The second one of them was insufficient capacity for additional spaces in the greenbelt inset. And we've already slightly jumped ahead and touched on that in the parking strategy document. We just in terms of car parking in the inset, MSCP2 is already consented, and perhaps you can just confirm for the inspectors what's proposed for that in terms of phasing.
Yes, so the airport's current proposal is to bring forward multi-storey car park 2, which was consented. It doesn't form part of this application. It was consented as part of the 10 million passenger consent, and it's to bring forward that car park first. So it is a revision to the phasing which was originally discussed and agreed with officers at the time of the determination of the application.
And then MSCP3 is part of this application. That has a gross capacity of 2,150. You'll be pleased to know, sir, I did do my lateral flow test this morning. I'm absolutely fine. I've reported it to the NHS. This is just a cough. But loss of 650 spaces, so there's the net 1,500 spaces.
Yes, because when you build the car park, you'll lose some of the surface level car parking.
So that leaves a residual requirement for 2,700 spaces. So, what about the suggestion that those 2,700 spaces should be provided in the greenbelt inset? What's your position on that?
I think, well, my position is consistent with the view taken by officers at the time of the application's determination, and that's that there is insufficient capacity in the inset to accommodate that residual requirement. And maybe if I just unpack that a little. As I'm sure inspectors will be aware, there's certainly no further space north side for further surface level car parking. And part of the reason for that is you can't, the inset is very, very compact at the moment, and you couldn't deliver further car parking airside because of the security requirements there. And I think officers agreed that further surface level car parking in the inset isn't a viable option. So then you have to consider whether further multi-storey car parking could be provided in the inset. And again, the analysis we've undertaken, which is contained in the parking strategy, sets out that has confirmed that wouldn't deliver a sufficient number of spaces, and indeed could lead to adverse impacts in terms of impacts on landscape and visual receptors.
And what about, the sort of potential candidate locations? Mr. Gertler said he looked out of his hotel room, and which was, I think, the on-site hotel, and he could see an open space, and why couldn't we put a car park there? Don't know which way his hotel room was facing. I didn't ask him that, but you know, one could see. Why don't we bring up CD 1.8 again? Just have a look at the site. So if we bring up CD 1.8, the plan, we can see the hotel, which is over towards sort of northwest of the terminal building with its own car parking just to the west of it. There's what looks like an open area between the hotel and the terminal. What is that?
There are other ancillary uses in that area. That includes an area for coach parking as well. Just to add that area there, there is an extant consent for further development of the hotel, which would take up some of that area to the east of the hotel.
And the inspectors may recall this from their site visit, but what happens with the levels within that area?
The land drops away quite steeply in that area, which does prohibit development opportunities.
And what about to the north of the existing car parks? You know, the rear of Downside Road. What about that as a candidate?
I think in that area there's two main difficulties really. The first is there will always be a need to retain circulation through the airport site, which makes development there very difficult. And secondly, any decked or multi-storey car parking in that location would be very close to the residential receptors along Downside Road to the north.
What about, I mean, we can see, because of the boundary of the airport, there's a sort of almost from Downside Road, there's some long properties which will sort of cut into the to the landside area there. Yeah. There's a sort of pinch point, and there's the circulation route there, but what about in that area? Is there any potential for a multi-storey or decked or whatever car park?
Well, you could look at that area around the gyratory, but the gyratory itself really does limit siting options, and that is needed as part of this scheme to improve flows through the airport site. And just in itself, it's quite a long, thin strip of existing car parking, so I doubt it would deliver a significant increase in capacity, given that you would lose some of that capacity to construct any multi-storey or deck car park.
And we touched on the parking strategy before, but what was the conclusion from the parking strategy?
Yes, so the parking strategy did look at an option, as we mentioned earlier, so this is option B, of further, so this is in addition to multi-storey car park 3, of further decked or multi-storey car parking in the north side of the airport. But it concluded, as I mentioned previously, that the additional capacity it would provide would be very limited and wouldn't meet the residual requirement of 2,700 spaces, and it would potentially have significant impacts on the visual amenity of the residential receptors along the north side road.
And then, because of suggestions from others, including XR elders, of the possibility of car parking within the green belt, inset, you in your rebuttal, you produced an Appendix A, which just looked at both north side and south side options, but an alternative deck multi-storey car park, north side option, and we can see the heights assumed, and just for the purpose of trying to understand visual effect, where notionally was that cited?
The car park to the north.
Yeah.
It was, I think from memory, it was in the vicinity of, sorry, along the alignment of MSCP 1. So following that alignment, so it would be, yeah, probably in that area, which it does include a gyratory. In that sort of general vicinity to the north of the airport site.
And we can see there is obviously a notional
Yes.
exercise, but we can we can see there, we don't need to go through it, the broad conclusions on that. And then, so still going through this sequential.
Ms. Stanford, is that a good moment to break?
It is actually, yes.
Sort of
totally
idea, and give your voice the rest as well.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, let's adjourn 25 past, please. Right, if we could resume, please. Mr. Humphreys, how are we doing on time? Mike.
I've been an hour and 20 minutes, that leaves me 40 minutes. I would say I'm very slightly behind time, but not grossly so.
That's fine. Okay, thanks.
Mr. Melling, we've been going through these various different sort of sequential ways of meeting parking demand. The next one I'm going to touch on and then leave because it becomes very special circumstance too. So the next one is no suitable off-site alternatives outside the green belt, and just for the inspector's note, parking strategy CD 2.12 section 5.4 deals with that. That's all the park and ride location. So we'll come back to that in very special circumstance too. So I'll move on to the fourth of them, which is on-site opportunities within the green belt. And there, the parking strategy, so CD 2.12, looked at two different alternatives at section 5.5, that's PDF page 33, options C and D, and option C was decked car parking in the south side, i.e. within the existing silver zone, and option D was the year-round use of the seasonal silver zone car park extension, in other words, part of the current application. So again, I suppose we're really focused on the first of those, option C, decked car parking within the existing silver zone. Obviously we know that was rejected, but why was that rejected as an approach for dealing with car parking demand?
Yeah, in just to put it sort of in summary, really, it was because of the concerns that that option would result in greater effects on visual amenity and on the openness of the green belt compared to the proposed extension to the silver zone car park. And you can see that from the comparative analysis which is contained at Appendix A to my rebuttal. So that confirms that conclusion that was presented in the parking strategy. There was also another reason as well, and that's because of the cost involved in providing a decked or multi-storey car park to the south side. There would be a consequential need to charge a premium for that facility. And I think certainly the airport's experience, and certainly my experience of other airports, is that customers will generally only pay a premium fee for a facility if they can walk to the terminal from that facility.
And then as far as the seasonal car park is concerned, what is the part of the current application, we know from the highways evidence, obviously that doesn't add to summer peak demand because it's already available. Yep. Then that's a winter demand facility. So I want to move next to the next option in this sort of hierarchy, opportunities contiguous to the airport site and in parking strategy, CD 2.12 again, this was section 5.6, where this was considered PDF page 35. And we know a number of different sites were considered, and again, perhaps you could just explain to the inspectors how we've ended up with the Silver Zone extension.
Yes, I think I summarise the sort of the benefits, if you will, of the extension in my proof of evidence, page 96, paragraph 5.4.31. So yes, in summary, that site has a number of benefits. So it's well located, being to the south of the airport site. It benefits from the existing services and facilities in that location, and that includes the Silver Zone car park reception building, which inspectors may have seen when they undertook their visit, and that provides the shuttle bus service for passengers to take them to and from the terminal. And that location is also well suited for block parking, so that's where you don't need public access. It also has good access to the A38 and can be readily integrated with the wider surface access proposals that form part of the scheme.
And we know that the council, indeed, I think it's true of other parties as well, no one, if we need to go into the green belt south of the airport, no one is suggesting an alternative or better site to the Cogloop 2 site, S2 as it's also known, and we obviously know the views of officers on this one. So I'm going to move us on now to a slightly different topic, which is phasing, and the proposal to deliver car parking in 2 phases. Again, perhaps just briefly explain that to the inspectors.
Yes, I think I mentioned this earlier this morning. So the airport is now proposing a 2-phased approach to delivery of car parking. So in the first phase would see the delivery of multi-storey car park 2, MSCP2, which was, as I explained, consented as part of the 10 MIPA consent. And the removal of the seasonal restrictions on the seasonal car park, and that would be in parallel with investment in public transport improvements. And then in phase 2, that would see the delivery of the further extension to the Silver Zone car park and multi-storey car park 3. And that would be in the second phase, and that would be subject to a monitor and manage approach.
And again, the inspectors are obviously familiar from seeing the conditions with the monitored and managed approach, but how do you anticipate that is going to work in practice?
Yeah, so the intention is that would be secured by condition, and that would take into account factors such as parking demand, passenger throughput, and the capacity of any off-site facilities, park and ride facilities that may have come forward in that time. And that would basically ensure that the parking only comes forward when there is sufficient demand for it. And at this stage, because of its ability to better meet the demand for low-cost parking, the expectation is that the extension to the Silver Zone car park will come forward before multi-storey car park 3, but that would be subject to a monitor and manage approach, which would need to take into account a type of demand.
And then in your proof on page 99, from paragraph 5.4.44, 5.4.44, page 99, you say that the airport's proposed phasing represents a balanced and controlled approach to the delivery of additional car parking, and for three reasons. And again, those are set out, but just to explain briefly and touch on those, that why in principle is this a balanced and controlled approach? Why is this appropriate?
Well, the proposals reflect what the evidence is telling us, and it's telling us that the 4,200 spaces are required. So it's consistent with that evidence, and the phasing that's being proposed is consistent with that identified in the parking demand study updates, which assume that MS multi-storey car park 2 would be delivered by 10 million passengers per annum, and that the year-round use of the Silver Zone car park will be needed to meet winter demand. And through that monitor and manage approach in particular, it will ensure that any parking provision does not undermine the airport's targets for public transport mode share that will be contained in the airport surface access strategy. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the approach is intended to meet the demand for low-cost parking and thereby enable the airport to provide an attractive alternative to unauthorised off-site providers.
And then I suppose picking up that final point, the Council has suggested that low-cost parking should be provided in MSCP 3 or in the multi-storey car parks. And you know, the airport's been very clear on its position there, but again, explain for the inspectors why that is not appropriate.
I think there are a couple of factors. First of all, I think we just need to look at other UK airports and the pricing structures they adopt, whereby they charge a higher rate for parking that is closer to the terminal. And secondly, due to the costs, and that I mean by costs I mean capital costs, but also finance costs associated with the delivery of multi-storey car parking, there is a need to reflect that in the charges, in the parking fees that are charged to passengers to cover those costs.
And I mean, Mr. Gertler says, oh well, look, you haven't got a viability assessment. I mean, is this a matter of viability assessment?
I don't think it is. We're not. This is a private sector development. It's not a public funded development, and it's not like a housing development where there might be a requirement to deliver a proportion of that development which is affordable housing or something like that. And I think, you know, Mr. Geller does accept, and I think most parties accept, that multi-storey car parks do cost more to deliver. And I think, you know, Val's proposals reflect that and reflect the experience at other airports.
And, you know, if a multi-storey car park is provided, you know, at a price, you know, a parking cost that reflects the cost of providing a multi-storey car park, is that providing a realistic alternative to the car parking, the unofficial car parking in the Greenbelt?
The Silver Zone car park will provide a...
No, would a multi-storey car park priced as a multi-storey car park would need to be?
No, it wouldn't. What we have to remember is that the Silver Zone car park will be charged at a lower rate, which is closer to the prices that are charged in the unofficial off-site car parks.
Now, in fact, in our many documents, we do, interestingly, have, I think it's CD 15.1, document which we haven't looked at before, but this was an application for judicial review brought by parking operators around Bristol Airport against the council, with Bristol Airport Limited as a interested party in 2017. Permission was to bring the judicial review was not granted, but the claimant was seeking to challenge the decision of the defendant, council, to grant the application of the interested to the airport for outline permission for a multi-storey car park and for 3,650 seasonal car parking spaces. And the court there, you can see from the judgment, clearly said that the council was entitled to take into account the different economic trends and development requirements, that the pricing strategy of the developer is not itself material to a decision. But what does that tell us about the car parking operators around Bristol Airport and their propensity to litigate?
Well, just to take a step back, just very, very briefly on this point, I think what the challenge shows is that economic trends and development requirements are a material consideration. But the pricing strategy of the airport isn't irrelevant to the planning decision, and I think that's the view that was taken by the judge in that context, and that was accepted by and referred to by officers in the officer's report on this application. In terms of what it tells us about off-site operators, well, it potentially tells us that they will take litigation measures against the airport if they think there's any issue of competition, law risk, or anything like that.
And
they are litigious.
In your rebuttal, Appendix B, you produce a very short note from a partner at Womble Bond Dickinson, just drawing attention to potential competition law risks if the airport was to price its multi-storey car parks in what I'll call a sort of slightly predatory way in order to compete with off-site car parks. I mean, obviously this is not, we're not trying to resolve here a competition law issue, but what's the reality? What's the risk from the airport's point of view of being forced or being told it has to price multi-storey car parks as though they were lower cost surface level car parks?
Yeah, I think what this advice is telling us is that if the airport somehow offset the higher cost it would normally charge for, say, MSCP3, and charge a lower rate, then it would potentially open up the airport to competition law risk. That's what this legal advice is telling us.
And then I want to move to a slightly different point, which is just to understand the consequences of under-providing car parking at the airport against demand, whatever level of demand the inspectors think appropriate, the consequences of under-providing car parking. And sort of two principal things I wanted to ask about. First is the unofficial or unauthorized off-site car parking. So deal with that one first, as a consequence of under-providing car parking.
Yes, it seems to me that if the airport didn't provide parking on site to meet demand, then you would have to ask, where will that parking demand be met? And one of the answers to that is that it would be met by unauthorised, unofficial, off-site car parks. And that in turn, you know, I think in my proof of evidence I refer to some appeal decisions, and that demonstrates the potential impacts of that situation in terms of undermining the airport's ASAS targets, but also it would result in impacts on the local environments, on local communities, which, you know, we've heard from some of the local residents about the issues associated with some of those car parks.
And then the second potential impact which you identify in your proof is on drop-off and pickups. Again, how should the inspectors view that as a potential consequence of under-provision of car parking?
I think Mr. Witchell's dealt with this during his evidence, and this was a position agreed with the council's officers as well, that drop-off and pick-up is very much at the bottom of Mr. Witchell's transport hierarchy, if you remember that. And that's because it results in, it doubles the amount of movements, and so hence that's why it's at the bottom of the transport hierarchy. So there's a risk that if you don't provide enough parking on site, some of that demand will be met by passengers choosing to drop off and pick up instead.
And we heard from local residents both in the first week, but also in the day for non-represented parties the week before last, about taxis and other pickup vehicles waiting in local villages or along the sides of roads, and also vehicles passing through villages and so on. Again, you know, looking at the consequences of not providing enough car parking to meet demand, well, again, how should the inspectors view that particular feature?
Again, there is a risk that if you don't provide enough capacity on site, that there could be an increase in that parking on local streets. And also, just to, you know, we need to consider the parking provision, but also the measures that the airport are proposing to tackle some of these issues. And that includes a contribution to NSC for enforcement measures and measures to tackle some of this short-term waiting on local streets and the roadside.
Staff parking I was going to ask you about, but I'll pass over. Mr. Renshaw will ask you questions on that tomorrow insofar as he needs to. Very briefly then, very special circumstance 2 was further sites outside the Greenbelt, and we just briefly touched on that before, but it is separately very special circumstance 2. In the parking strategy, CD 2.12, there's an entire section on this, section 5.4, which starts at PDF page 29. I don't want you to go through it in any detail because the council are not suggesting that there are other sites outside the Greenbelt, but just briefly outline what was done. I suspect it's a topic that Ms. Sutherland may want to ask you about. So just explain what the airport did on this, please.
Yes, so the parking strategy and this particular element of parking strategy was undertaken by transport planners at Wood, and it looked at a long list of sites that had been identified in liaison with NSC officers and also Bristol City Council. And that long list of sites, I think there were 25 sites, was subject to assessment. And that resulted in a short list of 12 sites that were considered in more detail. But as a result of that exercise, no suitable alternative sites were identified. And that was because of various constraints, such as the distance of those sites from the airports, the availability of land, the need for remediation. And also, there was quite a long determination period of the application, and I know officers sought views from other councils as well on some of those sites, and that confirmed that during that time, some of the sites had been redeveloped. In the case of some other sites, they had been allocated for employment uses, and so weren't suitable for the provision of park and ride. And on that basis, officers came to the same conclusion. And I think my understanding is that is the same position of the council now.
And then we know that over recent times there have been applications for park and rides. The need realizations application was made and then withdrawn, and the officers, in fact, in the officers' report on this application did comment on that. Also, more recently, the Heathfield Park application was made and has been refused for, I think, 11 reasons. Just generally, does the our appeal application preclude other sites outside the Greenbelt or indeed wherever coming forward, particularly obviously if that relieves pressure on the Greenbelt?
No, it doesn't. The monitor and manage approach actually, includes a provision for monitoring provision of park and ride sites should a suitable site come forward.
And then very special circumstances, circumstance 3 is just the general need for and benefits of the airport, and we'll obviously deal with that in the planning balance topic. So I think we just get to the in effect the conclusion, your conclusion on whether there are very special circumstances that outweigh harm. What's the extent of the harm? What's the extent of the very special circumstance? And what's your view on that?
So, yes, my conclusion is that there is only limited harm to the Greenbelt as a result of this proposal, and that there are clear, very special circumstances that outweigh that harm, and indeed that was the same conclusion as that reached by officers in the consideration of the application.
Mr. Melling, thank you very much, and I think I'm 5 minutes within my estimate, so thank you, sir.
Thanks very much. Just before turning over to Mr. Taylor, can I just pick up on a couple of points? One goes way back. You were talking about, I think it was Cogloop 2 at the time, and I think you made a reference to the possibility of intermittent lighting. That is to say, lighting that would only come on movement sensors,
Yes,
presumably.
that's my understanding.
And is that Cogloop 2 or was it Cogloop 1 and 2?
So at the moment, Cogloop 1, so the existing seasonal car park, has the temporary lighting that they bring on and pull off in the winter months. The proposals now would be that there would be the intermittent lighting on both Cogloop 1 and Cogloop 2. So actually a bit of an improvement really for Cogloop 1 because of that downward lighting, and it would be intermittent as well.
So it's both. Okay, thanks. And the other point, just moving on slightly, we've talked quite a bit about the idea of multi-storey or decked car parking along the northern section of the site, and particularly you were talking about the pinch point caused by the gyratory. So we're looking along that area.
Yes.
And you said that you would be concerned about the impact of on residential amenity in Downside Road. I just want to be clear, was that comment about the concern for residential amenity relation to multi-storey or multi-storey and decked? And by decked, just to be clear, I'm talking of a single deck over existing parking, which I think everybody is now. But was it both you were concerned about?
It is both, yes. Obviously, multi-storey would be worse than decked, but yes, both.
Okay. No, that's fine. Very helpful. Thanks a lot. Okay, Mr. Taylor, let's begin the cross-examination. Look to break for lunch at about 1 o'clock.
Mr. Melling, I'm going to begin, please, by asking you to take out Mr. Gertler's proof of evidence and turn in that to PDF page 17.
Sorry, could you tell me the actual page number rather than... I've got his proof printed out here, so...
Page 12.
Page 12. Yes.
And at paragraph 40, Mr. Gertler identifies the physical elements of the proposed development within the green belt. And there are the 4 elements there. He's identified those elements correctly, hasn't he? As lying within the green belt.
Yes, they are the developments in the green belt.
Yeah. And we know, don't we, that the council identified in its reasons for refusal conflict with Greenbelt policy on the basis of the development associated with the B and C in that list, didn't they?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And Mr. Gertler, in his proof, also identifies that in his view, element A, the taxi widening and fillets, and D, the improvements to the A38 in its junction with Downside Road, are also inappropriate development. That's what he says in his evidence, isn't it?
That's Mr. Gertler's view, and I obviously don't agree with that view.
But if we turn to his proof, please, it's page 8 of the PDF, page 3 of the proof itself.
You say page 3?
Yeah. At paragraph 9 of his proof, Mr. Gertler explained that the evidence that he's prepared and provided is true and is being prepared and is given in accordance with the guidance of my professional institution. And he confirms the opinions expressed are his true and professional opinions. Under the RTPI code, he is required in his evidence to give his true and professional opinions, isn't he?
He is, yes.
And given that his view, his personal view, was that the taxiway widening and fillets and the improvements to the A38 in its junction with Downside Road were inappropriate development, he was under a professional duty to report that to the inspectors, wasn't he?
He notes it in his proof of evidence, but he does spend quite a lot of time on those points, and it is a departure from the reasons for refusal and also the council's statement of case.
Right, so are you saying that he shouldn't have reported in his views relating to taxi widening and the improvements to the A38 in his proof? That he didn't have a professional duty to do that? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that.
Right.
What I'm saying is that he may note it, but he spends quite a lot of time in his proof of evidence on that point.
Right, because he has to explain his view, doesn't he?
He does.
That's a requirement.
But my understanding is that is not the council's case.
Right. Let's look, please, at page 67 of the PDF of Mr. Gertler's proof. It's page 62 of the internal pagination of the document. And at the bottom of this page there's a footnote. You see footnote 20. And that says, for the avoidance of doubt, I have conducted this balancing exercise. That's to say the balancing exercise required for the purposes of what is now paragraph 148 of the MPPF, by focusing on the extension to the Silver Zone car park and the lifting of seasonal restrictions. I have not brought in the additional parts of the proposed development which amount to inappropriate development, namely the taxiway widening and fillets, as well as the A38 highway works. In my view, consideration of these matters would only strengthen my conclusion. See that?
Yes.
So, in the balancing exercise, Mr. Gertler has included as inappropriate development the same two elements that you've included in your exercise, hasn't he?
According to what he has said there, yes.
And so Mr. Gertler's balancing exercise is presented on the basis of the matters identified by the council in their reasons for refusal, isn't it?
It is, according to what he said there, although he does obviously make the point that his conclusion would be strengthened by consideration of those other elements.
Yes. It's open to the inspectors of this appeal to consider for themselves whether the taxiway widening and fillets and the improvements to the A38 and its junction with Downside Road are amount to inappropriate development, isn't it?
They can, yes, it is open to them. However, I would say that my understanding is Mr. Gertler was advising the council during the preparation of its statement of case, and I believe that the council could have raised this matter in its statement of case.
Right, but the council's position is set out in its reasons for refusal and its statement of case, and that relates to the seasonal use of the existing Silver Zone car park, Cog Loop 1, and the extension to the Silver Zone car park, Cog Loop 2, isn't it?
That's what it says in its reasons for refusal.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, it just, I think, one short point that arose out of your evidence in chief in relation to the A38 Downside Junction improvements. You took us to, I think it was CD 3.4.8, and there was a CD 3.4.8, page 15.
Yes, this is the visualization, yes.
And certainly, I'm having trouble myself. See, it was page 15 of CD 3.4.8. So. And we've got the existing view at the top and the proposed view at the bottom.
Yes.
Is this junction not going to be signalised?
Yes, I think the note makes clear that for the purposes of the visualization, the signals aren't included.
Right.
But, I mean, it would be similar to what would be there as the existing.
Okay. And I think you said, in your view, the change here would result in negligible impact.
Yes.
So there is some impact on openness.
I would say it's extremely, I would actually say there's no impact on openness.
Right,
and that, can I just finish, that is consistent with the view of officers, and it's consistent with the view taken by North Somerset Council and others in respect of the South Bristol link.
Okay, so we can note your evidence is changing from negligible impact in chief to now no impact when I asked you about it. Right, that's helpful, thank you. Right. Now, let's turn to the MPPF, if we may. And we've got that at CD 5.08.1. And I'd like to take you in that to page 43. That's 43 of the PDF. So. And at paragraph 147, we can see under the heading Proposals Affecting the Green Belt that inappropriate development is by definition harmful to the Green Belt and should not be approved except in very special circumstances.
Yes.
So we can note that any inappropriate development results in harm, doesn't it?
Yes, inappropriate development results in harm.
Yeah. Okay. And we can see that if very special circumstances are not demonstrated to exist for all the land within the green belt that a proposal affects, then planning permission for that development should not be approved. That's the consequence of 147, isn't it?
It would need to be taken into account in planning balance, but the policy there is clear that very special circumstances need to be demonstrated.
Yes. So, in essence, if you don't demonstrate very special circumstances for development which includes land in the green belt which is inappropriate, then your development is contrary to the MPPF and should not be approved. That's right.
It would be contrary to paragraph 148.
Right. How do you read the phrase should not be approved? Does that mean should not be granted planning permission?
I would say that, yes, that element should not be granted planning permission.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mine is muted.
Mine is too. All right. If there's anything I need to do in terms of moving the microphones, I'll do whatever's necessary. But I've not had problems before, I don't think. Right. Let's move on to paragraph 148. So we see at 148 that when considering any planning application, local planning authorities should ensure that substantial weight is given to any harm to the green belt.
Yes.
So we've seen that where you propose inappropriate development, that by definition gives rise to harm. And so what this means is that where you propose inappropriate development, that harm has to be given substantial weight.
Yes, that harm needs to be given substantial
Yeah.
weight, taken into account the degree of that harm.
Yeah, so even the smallest harm possible to openness is to be given substantial weight, isn't it?
I think it does depend on the degree of that harm, and obviously that needs to be taken into account in the planning balance.
Yes.
And weight afforded to it. But
But
clearly
this-
it's important that the degree of harm is taken into account.
Right, exactly, because the lowest point of harm gets given substantial weight, and then from that point up, higher degrees of harm get even more substantial weight, don't they? That's how the policy in paragraph 148 operates.
I don't think it says that.
Right, okay, so explain to me then how on your basis a low degree of harm gets given anything less than substantial weight in accordance with this paragraph.
I've given it important weight in my planning balance.
You've given it important weight but not substantial weight.
Yes, substantial weight in accordance with paragraph 148.
Okay, so you've given your assessment of harm substantial weight.
Yes, I've given it
Right.
substantial weight.
Now let's step back and think about this conceptually. Even the very smallest amount of harm to openness has to be given substantial weight when you're applying paragraph 148. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And so from that point upwards, as the degree of harm rises from that smallest amount, the amount of substantial weight, the weight you get, just gets greater. It's even more than substantial weight, isn't it?
I think the paragraph there is this, is substantial weight must be given to the harm. It doesn't say anything about scaling up that harm. But in any case, I have taken into account the degree of harm
Right.
in coming to my planning balance.
Exactly, because your argument as to the degree of harm goes to the degree of weight above substantial weight that should be given when applying paragraph 148, doesn't it?
So I don't think I follow you. Could you
Right.
repeat the question?
Okay. The smallest amount of harm that one can conceive of to openness gets substantial weight. So when you're arguing about the degree of harm to openness, as you do in your evidence, what you're arguing about is the degree of weight above substantial weight that one gives to the harm to openness. It follows as a matter of logic applying paragraph 148, doesn't it?
Yes, and you take into account the degree of harm, and then you weigh that against the very special circumstances.
Thank you. Now, in terms then of how we have to take a decision, we can see the next sentence of 148, very special circumstances will not exist unless potential harm to the greenbelt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm resulting from the proposal is clearly outweighed by other considerations. So, when we talk about very special circumstances, we'll be careful with our language, don't we? Very special circumstances is the outcome of a balance where the harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm is clearly outweighed by the considerations. That's right, isn't it?
Very special circumstances are taken into account in the planning balance.
Right, okay. All right, I'll leave that for submission. I put the point. In terms of what one has to weigh in the balance, we can see that you have to weigh harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm against other considerations. Now, you've referred to a number of other decisions about related to the airport where decisions have been taken to grant permission on greenbelt land for airport-related development. Each of those decisions involves its own determination of the degree of harm by reason of inappropriateness, the other harm that may result, and indeed the other considerations.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the very special circumstances that were advanced in respect of those applications are similar to those that are being advanced now.
Yeah, I think that's why I tried to ask my question about language earlier. See, the very special circumstances are not the reasons to justify development. The very special circumstances will not exist unless, you see what it says? The harm by reason of inappropriateness and other harm is clearly outweighed by other considerations.
Yes, and we will come to this in my planning balance, where I argue that the benefits of the scheme outweigh the overall
Right.
adverse impacts.
All
of the
those
scheme.
previous decisions involve different assessments of harm by reason of inappropriateness, different assessments of other harm, and a balance against different other considerations than the ones that were presented in this appeal, didn't they?
I would go back and look at the application to expand the airport to 10 million passengers per annum and say that a lot of the impacts and the issues we are considering here were similar.
Really?
In respect
In the
of
10
that
MP, in the
application.
10 MPA decision, did they have to take into account the impact on openness of the site that we know as Cog Loop 2?
In terms of, you were talking about the wider impacts of the proposal, the wider impacts
No.
of growth to 12.
I'm talking about the factors that go into the judgment as to whether or not very special circumstances exist. And I'm saying to you that each case has to be determined on its merits, looking at the three factors, and that they were different in each case compared to the appeal scheme. That's right, isn't it?
Some of the factors were similar, because when you're looking at the development of the current extension to the Silver Zone car park, that involved similar developments on greenfield land.
I see. All right. Thank you. I've put exactly what I need to there and got exactly the answer I was looking for. Thank you very much. Sorry? No, I was thanking the witness for his answer. Dear, oh dear. Right. Let's move on then, please, to look at some of the NPPG guidance. Page 10 of Mr. Gertler's proof, which is page 5, internal pagination. And here Mr. Gertler quotes from, he provides the wording from the PPG, which, although we've got it as CD 5.9, if you go there, I don't think you'll find the text, which is why I've gone here. But I've checked that the words are the bits that I want to take you to. His 22A, the guidance says that openness is capable of having both spatial and visual aspects. In other words, the visual impact of the proposal may be relevant as could its volume. Refers to, in looking at openness, the duration of the development and its remediability being relevant, taking into account any provisions to return land to its original state or to an equivalent or improved state of openness, and lastly, the degree of activity likely to be generated, such as traffic generation. Those are all relevant matters for the inspectors to consider when they're looking at the potential impact of development on openness, aren't they?
Yes, they are set out in the planning practice guidance.
All right, thank you. Now, in terms of the history of the contribution that the land that we're looking at here, that in terms of the Cog Loop 1 and 2 makes to the green Mr. Gertler, in his proof, page 12 of the PDF, page 7 for you, Mr. Melling, at paragraph 26, provides a quote from the inspector who examined the replacement local plan. And Mr. Gertler explains that at the time of that examination, this is paragraph 26, the predecessor to Bell wanted the Greenbelt inset to cover the whole of the operational airport, together with the additional land to the south, which the airport had an option to purchase in order to extend surface car parking once passenger throughput exceeded 6 mppa. And the inspector rejected that argument, and we've got the conclusion there set out that the inset should exclude that part of the operation area situated north of the northern runway and east of Cook's Bridle Path. In my judgment, this would define an area in which all development that would clearly require express planning permission and undoubtedly be inappropriate development would be expected to take place in the period up to 2020, which is regarded as sufficiently long-term to meet the requirements of PPG2. Gosh, that's a phrase I haven't said out loud for a long time. It's broadly also the area within which development would be least likely to injure the visual amenities of the Greenbelt. Should additional development that would require express planning permission be required elsewhere within the operational area or on land currently beyond the airport limits, and that development be deemed to constitute inappropriate development, I consider it would be wholly appropriate for very special circumstances to have to be demonstrated to justify why that development could not be located within the inset. So we can see there the comments in 2006 of that inspector plainly recognising that the land that we're addressing in this part of the inquiry made a contribution to the Greenbelt. Otherwise he wouldn't have affected it.
Yes, it makes a contribution.
Okay. Then if we go on in the story, we can see in paragraph 28, Mr. Gertler explains the next part of the story was consultation on the issues and options stage for the core strategy in October 2007, and representations were made on behalf of Bristol Airport Limited that there should be an extension to the Greenbelt inset. But by the time of the inspector's report in March 2012, the Council had granted permission for the 10 MPPA scheme, and the inspector concluded that the development needs of the airport during the time frame of the core strategy had now been established by the grant of planning permission. And when looking at the Greenbelt boundary, you can see the conclusion that the land outside the inset still contributes to the purposes of its inclusion within the Greenbelt, notwithstanding the extant permission. So again, we see in March 2012 an inspector identifying that the land that we're concerned with at this inquiry within the Greenbelt makes a contribution to the Greenbelt.
Makes a contribution to the Greenbelt.
Yes. Now, since 2012, the openness of the land that we're talking to is, and since this, sorry, let me start that again. The inspector there reached that conclusion knowing the extent of the development associated with the 10 MPPA planning permission. Yes?
Yes.
All right. And the position then is that in terms of the conclusions of that inspector, there's been no material change to Greenbelt policy since 2012, is there?
Nope, no change.
And on the ground, there's been no material change either.
No material change.
Yeah. Okay.
However, what I would say is that the inspector here is this is in the context of a local plan and defining a greenbelt boundary, and that requires the application of the exceptions test, which
Yes.
is different to the test of very special circumstances.
Quite, but the parts we're looking at it involves a judgment as to whether or not that land continues to fulfil a greenbelt function in terms of openness.
Yes, the inspector concluded it fulfills
Now,
a function, but again, it comes to the judgment on the extent of that contribution to the purposes of the greenbelts.
now as development expands into the greenbelt and erodes it over time, would you accept that over time the land that remains, which is undeveloped, progressively becomes even more important in terms of the role it plays in preserving openness?
Not necessarily, no.
Right. It's a simple point that as the greenbelt becomes developed out and there's less of it, what remains becomes more important in terms of the policy objective for allocating land as greenbelt, namely the preservation of openness.
It depends on you've got to look at the scale of development we're talking about here, and in the context of the wider greenbelt, it's a very small proportion of land.
All right. Let's turn to Appendix A of your proof, please, and this is where you set out your appraisal of the impact of the development, as I understand it. It's page 150, I hope, of the PDF of your proof.
Again, if you could tell me the page number as it appears at the top of the page, that would be helpful.
It's page 2. I want to take you to page 2 of the appendix.
Page 2, yes.
And we can see here, I think, we can see on the left-hand side it's issued by you, digitally signed on the, what is that, the 14th of June 2021.
Yes, that's correct.
I think it's the American dating system it's using. It always throws me that. So we can see that this was prepared after planning permission had been refused by the council and after the appeal had been lodged. Is that right?
Yes, it was in response to the concerns raised in the council's statement of case.
Yeah. And if we turn on to the next page, page 151 of the PDF, it's page 3 of this document itself. At paragraph 1.1.2, we see that the note was prepared following comments made by North Somerset Council in its statement of case concerning harm to the Greenbelt, may be caused by these two components. An assessment of the Greenbelt was not previously undertaken by BAL, nor was one requested by NSC officers during the determination of the planning application, as it was considered that the proposed development would quite clearly result in only limited harm to the Greenbelt.
Yes, that was the conclusion
Yeah.
that I reached in preparing the planning statements
Yeah.
for this application.
So we can note that this assessment prepared by you,
it wasn't just prepared by me.
I think it says it's issued by you with contributions from David Kenyon, Robert Deanwood and Neil Ferber. Yeah?
Yes.
But we can note that the starting point before this assessment started was that you had already reached the view that the proposed development would quite clearly result in only limited harm to the green belt.
Yes, I'd reached that view in the planning statements.
Yeah.
And that also took into account the findings of the landscape and visual impact assessment contained in the ES.
Yeah, so this appraisal was undertaken to achieve a result that was already known, wasn't it?
No, I can't accept that.
Okay.
It was undertaken by, supported by a qualified landscape architect who, and Mr. Deanwood as well, who's got significant experience in undertaking green belt assessment work, and the conclusions were reached taking into account their professional judgments as well.
Okay.
I think to suggest otherwise would be to undermine their the guidance they need to follow for their respective professional institutions.
Right. Okay. Now, in the way this appraisal works, the methodology we can see from, I think, table 4.2. Now, my notes have let me down already because I didn't write a page number down for that. Hang on, let me just see if we can get there. Yeah, if we turn to page 166.
Again, sorry, you'll just have to give me the actual
18.
18. Yeah, so just, yes, in terms of the methodology, in terms of the assessment of contribution of the parcels to openness, it very much is aligned with the council's own assessment of the green belt. It's consistent with assessments that have been undertaken elsewhere, and in fact, because of the way this assessment looks at other parcels, it allows for a more sort of finer grained assessment.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not asking about any of that. I'm just going to look at the methodology that you've applied, if I may. Table 4.2, you've looked at essentially three elements: visual openness, physical openness, and the quality of boundaries, brackets, permanence. So we can see there that in terms of physical openness, is that what is to equate to the concept in the guidance that we saw earlier of spatial openness?
Yes, spatial, and it also takes into account things like traffic generation and those elements as well, which are referred to in PPG.
Right. So the physical openness section takes into account the permanence of the development, does it?
Yes.
And it also takes into account the any movement associated
yes,
with
it does.
on site. Right. Okay. Thank you. We'll have a look and see whether that's the case in this report shortly. And what we can see too is that you've looked at the quality of boundaries: strong, moderate, weak. And a strong boundary is one that's a prominent physical feature, whereas a moderate one is a less robust physical feature. So in terms of whether a site contributes to openness, a site will contribute to openness more effectively if it has a weak boundary. Is that the way this works?
I think this recognises that boundaries do play a role in defining visual openness in particular, so they can provide natural screening of views.
Right, sorry, I'm trying to understand how this interrelates with the concept of openness, which is what we're interested in here.
Yes, so yeah.
The more of a barrier a boundary presents to a view, the more it interrupts
Yes, the
openness
more
in
it
visual
interrupts
terms. It would also have a consequence in terms of physical openness, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So if we've got a strong boundary, then that is a boundary which is resulting in an interruption of openness, effectively.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. And we can see from 424 on page 19, that's 167 of the PDF, that the methodology that you've deployed derives or gets us to a likely degree of harm on a 5-point scale. We can see it at 4.3, limited, moderate to limited, moderate to significant. And it says at 424 that reflects the application of professional judgment in the light of the likely effects on greenbelt purposes, its openness, visual and physical, and permanence, the quality of the boundaries which currently contain development or might do so. So we don't see anywhere here any explanation of the relative weighting given to each of those considerations, do we?
No. This is based on professional judgment.
So we don't understand, in terms of the way you've done the methodology, the relative importance that's been taken in any judgment, say, of visual openness compared to physical openness.
No, and I'm not sure if it would necessarily be appropriate to weight this. This is a professional judgment.
Yes. Part of that judgment must inevitably be ascribing weight to the relative weight of these three elements that you've looked at: the visual openness, the physical openness, and the quality of the boundaries, mustn't it?
In terms of a numerical weight, we haven't applied a numerical weight to this.
But you've also given no explanation at all as to which one you see as relatively more important than the other.
No, we've come to a rounded professional judgment.
Right, thank you. If we go on, please, to page 168 of the PDF, which is page 20 for you, Mr. Melling, we get to... Oh, actually, I've got the wrong page number. It's 167, page 19 for you, paragraph 4.3.1. You say this: the degree of harm which is likely to arise as a result of development can, in principle, be mitigated to some degree, for example, through detailed site master planning proposals, such as boundary planting or screening, which would interrupt immediate views of the development from various viewpoints.
Yes.
Now, you remember you agreed with me earlier that when we were looking at the quality of boundaries, that a strong boundary interrupts openness.
It can preserve visual openness if there is a boundary.
The purpose of mitigation, as described in this paragraph, is to interrupt immediate views and thus to preclude the appreciation of the open quality of land, isn't it?
The purpose of mitigation here is to preserve visual openness.
Right. How do you preserve visual openness if you interrupt a view from a viewpoint? How do you preserve openness if you're putting something in the way of that view? You can't, can you?
I would say it depends where, depends where you're looking at it from.
Well, you explain to me how mitigation, which interrupts an immediate view, preserves openness.
It reduces the visual impact of that component of the development.
You see, the reality here is that openness is more than just visual impact, isn't it? It's about the spatial perception of openness as well.
Spatial and visual.
Mm-hmm. And a policy of preserving openness cannot be fulfilled by interrupting immediate views of development, foreshortening views, and curtailing perception of openness, can it?
I still consider that boundary planting can prevent views of the development and therefore maintain wider openness in the context of the wider greenbelt.
Right, okay. I've put enough. Thank you very much indeed. Let's move on and talk about the spatial element of the concept of openness in a little bit more detail. Mr. Gertler, in his evidence, just find the right page. Yeah, it's his PDF page 11, internal page 6. Refers at 23C, so just above the heading History of the Greenbelt and Greenbelt Inset, to the Turner case and what Justice Sales says, that the openness of the Greenbelt has a spatial aspect as well as a visual aspect, and the absence of visual intrusion does not in itself mean that there is no impact on the openness of the Greenbelt, although it does not follow that the openness of the Greenbelt has no visual dimension. So I want to ask you about the spatial aspect now. We can see from that, can't we, that the spatial aspects of openness are not to be judged by what one can discern.
Not purely what one can discern. No.
No. There can be harm to the spatial aspect of openness without there being a visual impact.
They can, and then this is where you need to consider both the spatial and the visual. So there'll still be harm.
Yeah. I mean, to put it more colloquially, you don't need to be able to see a development in order for there to be a spatial impact upon openness.
Yes, in terms of the spatial harm.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, on that basis, visual mitigation will not mitigate a spatial impact, will it?
Not spatial impacts, it will mitigate the visual harm.
Thank you. Now, just so that we can understand the nature of block parking, I just want to ask you some questions about block parking and spatial impact. Mr. Gertler's proof, page 21 of the PDF, which is page 16 internally, at paragraph 56, refers to the Birds Farm decision, and in that decision letter the inspector identified that there's no statutory definition of openness, but I regard it as the absence of physical manifestations of development. The parking of densely packed cars on the scale involved here, where several hundred cars may be parked at one time, appears as a man-made development, and it clearly reduces the spatial openness of the land. There's a clear recognition there that block parking reduces the spatial openness of land. isn't there?
Yes.
And you don't disagree with that as a concept, do you?
I don't disagree with that as a concept. What I disagree with is the scaling up of the effect that Mr. Gertler does here with reference to that appeal decision, because you also need to take into account the context.
Right. Now, let me take you back to your Appendix A, please. Page 27 of Appendix A, page 175 for those on the PDF.
Sorry, could you repeat the page number there?
27, or page 175 of the PDF. And here we've got the evaluation in the first row. The question is, what is the nature and extent of the harm to the greenbelt arising from site development? And it says there'd be harm by virtue of its inappropriateness. The harm likely to arise from development is judged to be limited, i.e. no discernible effect on development on physical or visual openness and permanence. So the judgment that's been reached has been reached by reference to what can be discerned.
And what was that question?
The judgment reached here is one based upon what can be discerned.
Yeah, there's no effect. Very, very limited effect.
Well, hang on. The question relates to the language used here. It says no discernible effects of development on physical and or visual openness and permanence.
Yes, that's correct.
So the judgment that's been applied is whether or not an effect can be discerned, isn't it? That's what you've done.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, that's not the correct approach to apply to spatial openness, is it?
I think in this context, you need to take into account the existing use of the site,
Right.
which is an existing car park.
Okay. So, just so that I've understood it, this is table 4.6, isn't it, which is relating to the phase 2 site.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were looking at table 4.5. Sorry, table 4.6.
Yeah, I'm on page 27.
Yeah, table 4.5 is page 27.
Ah, sorry, I've got confused because of the misleading you were talking about before. Yes, okay. So this is the phase 1 car park, and so when you talk about discernible effect, what you've done is ask yourself whether you can discern the cars on the car park.
Yes, and you
Yeah.
you can't. I would say, especially if you look at not just the local views, if you look at the wider impacts, and you can see this from the landscape assessment work that's been done, and the zones of theoretical visual impact, that you can't see
Yeah.
the car park from a lot of receptors.
Yeah, but of course that's, as we've already discussed, not the correct approach to apply to the spatial element of openness, is it? Whether you can discern it.
It's this again. Here we're talking about an existing car park.
I mean, in spatial terms, to spatial openness, it's a nonsense to suggest, isn't it, that the parking of 3,650 cars on Cog Loop 1 year round does not has only a limited impact on spatial openness.
I disagree with that. The cars are parked there at, under normal operating conditions for a large proportion of the year. They won't be there all year round. The year-round use of the car park is needed to meet peak demand both in the summer and the winter, so it won't be necessarily 365 days per year.
Right. Thank you. Now, in relation to the spatial elements of Cog Loop 2, we've got table 4.6, which follows on page 176 of the PDF, page 28 internally, and here we see the conclusion reached that harm is likely to arise just to be moderate to limited. Some effects of development on physical and or visual openness or permanence, with clear opportunities for mitigation. And so we've got a distinction here in your assessment in terms of the overall degree of harm. So this element has got a higher degree of harm, yeah?
Yes, that's correct. Prior to mitigation.
Right. And the mitigation that's proposed is substantial boundary vegetation.
Yes, so there'll be a landscape bund to the south and west of the site.
Right. And the substantial boundary vegetation is put there to fulfil the objective of the mitigation strategy, which we saw before, was to interrupt immediate views.
The landscape bund preserves wider visual openness and prevents immediate views into the car park.
Mm-hmm. And where you get to, as I understand it, is on page 177, page 29, in relation to Cog Loop 2. So, having interrupted the views, the harm likely to arise from the phase 2 site is just to be limited.
Yes, that is the conclusion.
Right. So by limiting the views and interrupting the views of what can be seen of the open character, you have a reduction in the level of harm to openness.
Yes, and I think you need to think about what receptors we're talking about here. It's a very limited number of receptors along Winters Lane, and when we're talking about views, they're glimpsed views along Winters Lane. I
see. If we're looking at this spatially rather than in terms of views from particular receptors, the spatial impact of putting cars on Cog Loop 2 must be, mustn't it, greater than the spatial impact of putting cars on Cog Loop 1?
I would still contend it's still limited.
So was that a yes to my question?
There are already cars on Cog Loop 1, so yes, it will be greater, but still limited.
I see.
And just to continue, again, the cars won't be parked on that car park 365 days a year. It will be there to service peak demand.
Right. So the car park's going to lay empty for most of the year, is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying they lay empty for most of the year, but they're not used to their full extent the whole of the year.
There's going to be block parking of cars on Cog Loop 1 and Cog Loop 2 year round, isn't there?
Not necessarily year round.
Right. So, how often is Cog Loop 2 going to have no cars parked on it, Mr. Mellon?
I don't have those figures in front of me.
How often is it only going to be half full, Mr. Mellon?
How often is it going to be harmful?
Half full, yeah.
There will always be some harm. My view is that harm is limited.
You've got no evidence, have you, as to how many cars are going to be parked on Cog Loop 2 or Cog Loop 1 at any point in time in the year?
I think there is evidence that is presented in the parking demand study update, but I would need to go away and look at those figures.
Fair enough.
But it's quite clear to me, you can see when there is the winter peak demand, when there's demand in the Easter months, and that's what prompts the need to bring forward the year-round use of the Silver Zone, the existing Silver Zone car park.
Indeed. Let's just deal with a few more points. In terms of spatial impact, that's what I'm asking you about. There is a stark contrast of the use of this land with and without cars parked on there, isn't there? In terms of spatial impact.
I agree, there is spatial impact.
And you agree, don't you, that you can't mitigate that spatial impact with the sort of boundary planting that's being proposed?
I think when you look at the development in the context of the wider greenbelt and from the other viewpoints, I think it does serve to minimise the impact of the development on openness.
Right, that's not an answer to my question, Mr. Rennie, with the greatest of respect.
There is impact on spatial openness, but I contend that it's limited.
You can't mitigate the spatial impact with the boundary planting that's proposed, can you?
Not with the boundary planting,
No.
but the
please
nature of the development, so low rise, car parking not on there 365 days per year, the use of the net paved parking, so the grasscrete, which allows the grass to grow when areas aren't in use, does mitigate the harm.
And so there is no mitigation proposed that addresses the spatial impact of the parking of these cars on Cog Loop 1 or Cog Loop 2, is there?
I've just referred to some of the mitigation, so the grasscrete, which is already there at the moment, and that's when the car park's not in use, that allows the grass to grow, which I think minimises the spatial harm.
Right, thank you. Right, so I think that's an appropriate moment, if that's acceptable to you.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks very much for that. We'll take a lunch break till 2 o'clock then. Thank you.